Everyone, and thank you so much for coming to the March TREET seminar. It's really great to see everyone here today. Now, I know that for a lot of us in this room, our presenters today don't need any introduction, so if you'll just very briefly bear with me. Dr. Florence Clark is Associate Dean and Chair of the USC Division of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy, and she's also a very widely noted scholar. Over the last 2 decades, Dr. Clark has been the principal investigator of 3 large-scale NIH-funded R01 randomized controlled trials, including the USC Well Elderly Studies, which demonstrated that preventive occupational therapy cost-effectively can improve the health of older people and slow declines normally associated with aging. Dr. Clark has also been an invited member of several NIH review panels and committees, including most recently the Function, Integration, and Rehabilitation Sciences Subcommittee for the National Centers for Medical Rehabilitation Research. And as we know, Dr. Clark is currently the president of the American Occupational Therapy Association. Now, Dr. Michael Carlson. Mike Carlson is a research professor of occupational therapy in the OS-OT division. He is a social psychologist and occupational scientist with expertise in research design and statistical analysis. Dr. Carlson has also been very extensively and intensively involved in the development and oversight of NIH-funded large-scale RCTs, including the Well Elderly Studies and the Pressure Ulcer Prevention's in Spinal Cord Injury Project. He has authored and co-authored over 40 peer-reviewed articles on occupational science, occupational therapy, psychology, and medical science. So we're very lucky to have both Dr. Clark and Dr. Carlson here today. So please help me to welcome them.
Okay. What lapel? Do I have one? No, I don't think I'll be. Do I have to stand to use? Oh, I have to do the PowerPoints. Will you do them? Do the PowerPoints, and I'll just. I like sitting. Maybe I am better off doing the PowerPoints and standing. So I really want to start by saying that Mike and I were teamed up over 20. How many years? 18. How many years ago, Mike? 24 years ago. We've been working together for 24 years, and we were teamed up by Dr. Azen 24 years ago when Mike was in the social psychology, he was in the biometry master's program, but he was also a graduate of the psychology PhD program here in social psychology. And Stan just thought that Mike and I just fit together. And, right? And Stan was actually on my dissertation committee, and he really brought us together that many years ago. And we've been working together for all these years. And when we started, we really didn't know anything about getting funded. And it's really quite miraculous that we've been able to, over these years, eventually secure these 3 large-scale RCTs, these large R01s, and we've learned a lot in the process. Now, the presentation I'm going to give is, let me just back up a little bit and say that when Mike did come into our department, he was brought on because we were trying to get the fledgling science of occupational science established at USC. And we knew that to do that, first of all, we had to have a doctoral proposal that would fly, that would be approved by the graduate school. And second, we knew we needed to build a research portfolio. And so Mike was really hired to assist with all of that. And he became our major grant support person to go to in the department when different faculty were trying to get grants, secure grants. And over time, his grantsmanship skills became more and more refined, and he brought that biostatistical background to the venture, and he's been very, very instrumental in anything that our division has achieved. Not everything, but in a lot, not everything. But in many of our successes he's certainly been a critical player in that attainment. So I'm gonna be presenting largely from PowerPoints that were prepared by Teresa Cruz and Ann Cray at NCMRR. And they actually presented these PowerPoints at the American Occupational Therapy Association annual meeting. But since they work for the public, I think they're very happy when we disseminate their particular presentations to others. And so we will be, depending on their slides, but we will be accenting them with pointers from our experience. Why am I having trouble? Yeah, right. Okay. All right, I got it. So, you know, all of you know what NIH is. The main thing that differentiates NIH from NSF is the latter part of this definition, which is that the research that's funded by NIH is basically targeted to develop knowledge that enhances health, lengthen life, and reduce the burdens of illness. And 80% of the $31 billion that's awarded is awarded to extramural scientists, and that's you. The other amount, the remainder, is the remaining 20% actually goes to support NIH intramural research funding programs. And we actually have one doctoral student who's graduating now, Suk-Lee Liu, who will be going to NIH to work on intramural projects in stroke. So we're very proud of that. As you all probably know that there are 27 separate institutes and centers, and it's a maze to really work your way through the different NIHs, the different divisions. They all have different goals, different budgets, different personnel, different mechanisms, and so you really have to look at each one separately. They overlap with the use of certain mechanisms, but there's also differences in the institutes with respect to which mechanisms they will fund. Now, the one that I'm most familiar with is NCMRR, and that is it's not an institute, it's actually, it's a center within NICHD. This is the beginning of the maze, the National Institute of Child and Human Development. It's a center within that institute, and it was established in 1990 by Public Law 101-613. And what's different about this particular center is that it targets studies that really are designed to enhance the health, productivity, independence, and quality of life of persons with disabilities. So its focus is very much on the real world, actual impact of the science on the actual lives of people. And so they look to fund studies with outcomes that really relate to participation. It's always good to get to know the folks, and folks is a term that everybody seems to use at NIH. I noticed that everybody that spent some time at NIH uses the word folks. So it's good to know the folks who are the project specialists, the project directors at these different institutes. And I actually know all of these people quite well. And I know Carol Lee does because she's been on the National Advisory Board to this center, so have I. And over time, just these various individuals will serve as your project officer, and you really do develop a relationship, a friendship really, with these people who are sort of tracking your career and providing advice to you as you move along. And I have found my relationships with people at NCMRR to be very, very helpful. So I recommend that you get to know the people at the project officers at the institutes from which you're interested in receiving funding. These are other institutes among the many that I think would be particularly pertinent to those of you in this room, and certainly to our postdoctoral training center, this T32. So I think Carol Lee has a lot of her funding from NINS, from the Neurological Institute. Others of us might want to go to the Arthritis, Muscle Physiology, and Bone and Skin Institute. I suspect in PT you may have funding. Some of your folks might have funding from NIMS. NIA is an institute that has funded the well elderly studies, so I'm connected to that institute as well. And these are just other ones that would be likely to fund the kinds of research that relate to rehabilitation science. So the NCMR in particular is really interested in going beyond associative links and just confirming results, but really they want to see causative relationships, particularly as it relates to treatment now. That's a big emphasis. So really randomized controlled trials and other kinds of approaches that really look at causality are the sorts of studies that they're most interested in. And they're also really interested in mechanistic hypotheses. So, for example, in our grants, and we have, we have 3 trials that have been funded and a 4th one that we're hoping to deliver. We've been pregnant with that one for a long time, for 2 years. And we just resubmitted it, and we're very optimistic about it. But in all of those, in at least with the exception of the first one, in the 3 subsequent submissions, we did have a mechanistic kind of theoretical model that was tested along with our causative analyses. So, for example, in the well elderly studies, we proposed 4 possible factors that could be the mechanisms through which the intervention worked. And in that case, they were things like social support or activity engagement. Not mechanistic in the sense of neural mechanisms, but they were what we thought the intervention changed that in turn would produce the positive outcomes. So that's what they mean by mechanisms. It doesn't necessarily mean a neural mechanism. In our current submission, the sensory integration therapy grant that / environmental enrichment grant that we've just submitted, we do propose that the mechanism is going to be a change in sensory processing. So we try to combine in our outcome studies and our intervention studies a model that we're testing that is a theoretical model of the mechanisms that we propose change, and through change in those mechanisms, we would achieve the outcomes. You have to be, really have to try to see conclusive results when you're writing they're going to look for that. It used to be that, at least as in my experience, that you could have many outcomes that you would propose an effect for. But now it seems to me that in the more recent submissions, they really want you to sort out what are your primary outcomes and what are your secondary outcomes. You can't put in a grab bag of outcomes anymore. And insofar as you select particular primary outcomes, you have to have a theory that justifies why those outcomes and not others. So one of the things we've noticed over the years is that the reviews are getting more and more focused on these kinds of specifics than they had been. So when we started in 1993, you could do an intervention study. You could have a usual care control group. You didn't have to have a comparative group. You could a comparative treatment arm. So is that clear? Really, when we first did well elderly, we could have just had a no treatment control. In fact, we actually had a comparative group in that study. We had 3 groups. But I think actually they did demand that, now that I think of it. Actually, now that I remember, even back then they did in our first submission we had the well elderly intervention versus a control, no treatment control. And they did require us to have a 3rd arm of a social control group that we added in the revision. But it seems to me that for example, in the pressure ulcer study that we have now that's ongoing, and we're in almost our last year, we have only a no treatment control group, and that made it through peer review with just a no treatment control group. But in the newest submission that that is under review currently, we had to add a comparative treatment arm, and we have a usual care arm. So, I mean, things just keep getting more and more rigorous, I would say. And you've got to be you have to be able to defend every single choice you make about the patient population, the numbers, the inclusion and exclusion criteria. A lot of attention is paid to that, dosing, outcome measures. If there are animal models from which your basic theory is derived, you've got to explain that. It's very, very rigorous at this point. And I'm speaking now about grants of the kind that I submit to NCMRR, which are intervention type grants. They're RCTs. They're the kind of grants that this T32 center is training postdocs to conduct. Now, in applying to NIH, most of the funding goes to investigator-initiated type proposals, and those are R01s. And I think you all know that the funding is driven by peer review scores, and I think you all know that everything's electronically submitted now, and I think you know all of this information. One thing that I really didn't have clear until I was reading this is that it's 9 months at least between the time of submission and the time of funding. I really didn't have that. I thought it could be 6 months, but it is 9 months. Now you're only given 2 chances. So you can submit once. If it's not accepted on the first submission, you have 1 more try. And it used to be that we had three tries. This was interesting to me. I really didn't know that the typical R01, these are the R01s, that this is about $150,000 to $250,000 per year. I thought they were $500,000 per year. That's because the ones that the last 2 I've had have been almost $500,000 per year. And that was my frame. But I've since learned that most R01s won't be really even budgeted for 5 years, and that typically you would ask for between $150,000 and $250,000. And especially if you're a new investigator, I think it's good not to ask for $500,000 per year. It's probably, because you don't have that much of a track record, it's probably good to ask for less and less years. So why not then go for an R03 or an R21? Well, because you do get more money. It really what mechanism you use depends on the scope of your study. But there is some point where you need more resources than an R21 would give you, but you don't have to max out the R01 mechanism. So I think the key is to really do the budget in accord with what you're proposing, and don't propose more than someone with your degree of expertise can really execute. So scale is really important to think about. There are also the R03 and the R21 mechanisms. The R03s are really for very new for pilot work. Anybody can really do an R03. It's really for pilot work, to get pilot data. And it's a real stepping stone to a larger grant. They're $50,000 a year for 2 years, so they're pretty small grants, but they can give you the basic pilot data that you would need for an R01. The R21 is for innovative, high-risk, pushing the envelope, new methodology type grants. And I believe Beth Pytak is going to do an R21. I think that's where she's going next. Hers will be, I think, beginning to think about taking her qualitative data and developing an intervention for people with diabetes. It's very innovative, new paradigm kind of treatment. And then there's the clinical trials planning grants, the R34s. That's $100,000 for 1 year, but it gives you a year to plan a grant. Is that what you have, Sharon? An R34?
Ours is it's a specific R34 mechanism, so it was a 2-year grant up to, I think it was 300 or 350.
So it was a special mechanism, a variation on this basic mechanism, but this mechanism does exist for planning a trial.
Yeah, ours was a one-time only, which did allow for the collection of pilot data.
So if we thought about these different mechanisms, if I thought about these mechanisms in terms of something like the well elderly studies, how would this have played out? Well, I would have I would have had funding for, if you know about the needs assessment that we did at Angeles Plaza, a qualitative study of the needs of elders. That would have been probably the R03. And then the creation of the treatment manual and the planning of the team, that would have been the R34. And then we would have been ready for the R01. So, but we just jumped in back then and did the R01 all at once and did it all at once. And we didn't go through these mechanisms. We were able to obtain this grant in 1993 without a fully manualized intervention already in place, without pilot data. Well, we had the needs assessment, but without a lot of pilot data. And it was a very different time than now. And this is just the small business grants. And I mean, those of you in engineering would be interested in these mechanisms, which have to do with technology transfer. Now, the K awards are a whole separate thing, and it gets pretty confusing about whether someone, for example, who has a K2 now should go for an R21 next or go for a different K next. And that decision really, the difference between going for a K and going for an R is whether or not you still think you need mentoring. The Ks are really about providing not only protected time for research, but also protected time for additional mentoring. And so the grants look very, very different. These are some of the K. There's lots of K mechanisms. And Beth Pytak has a K02 now. But it's a KL2. It's been awarded through the CTSI here. But we also have several people, 3 people here that have Ks funded at USC through a KL2 training center at the University Medical Branch at Galveston and University of Florida through a cooperative relationship. They have K12s. So we have the K12s and the K2, KL2. The KL2s are through the CTSI. And then we have the K-12 people in our division at MPT who have Ks through this Galveston/University of Florida program. And in both cases, 75% of the time is bought out for working on being mentored and beginning to get a research program going. But the K-23 is would be the next step, is seen as the next step in a way for those interested in clinical mentoring and clinical research. The K-23 is seen as the next step if you've already had a KL2. But some people go to the R21. So you really have to keep these numbers straight, too, and I know I'm messing them up probably. I have the general concept. There are also things like mid-career investigator awards in patient-oriented research, and I've seen this. I've seen grants like this that are these K-24s, and they're for folks who already have been in practice for years. They're very experienced, and they want to make a switch into a scientific career. That's what those awards are. And then there's diversity supplements, and we have one of those under review right now in our division. And we're waiting to hear about that one. And that's to add qualified individuals at any level, high school through investigators who are from underrepresented minorities, come from disadvantaged backgrounds, have disabilities, they may have disabilities, and they're re-entering research. We have one K, I mean, you don't have to meet every one of these criteria, but these are the kind of folks for whom this mechanism exists. So this is what William Raub said. There is no grantsmanship that will turn a bad idea into a good one, but there are many ways to disguise a good one. And, this really has to do with grantsmanship. And I think that probably, from my experience, really poor grantsmanship will tank anything, basically. I mean, it's if the grant isn't written logically, if there are typos everywhere. One researcher I know who's been well funded in our field said messy grant equals sloppy researcher, sloppy scientist. So it's very important that the grant be packaged very, very, very carefully, and that there not be typos, that it be well thought out, that it not ramble, and so on. So what about winning over reviewers? Now I can speak also as a reviewer. You'll see that I'm on the standing committee of the NCMRR function integration internal committee. So now I've served on that for more than a year, so I've gone through a lot of cycles, and I've watched the process, and I've been reviewing grants. And so I can speak a little bit about this. Develop a focused application with explicit goals. Things need to be really boiled down, pared down, not all over the place. And then, again, provide a mechanistic basis if possible, if it fits in your study. And by mechanistic, it doesn't have to be biological, which is what I talked about previously. You raise an interesting question and you propose a solution. And then you use the most direct and appropriate means to critically address. It all sounds easy, but it's very hard to really do. And actually, we can't help you in actually writing these grants in a session like this. We can just give you a broad overview, but you're going to really have to work with someone who knows how to do this, I think, to be able to actually develop a fundable proposal. You're going to need, probably, if you haven't done it before, you're going to need ongoing critique and support and mentoring from someone who knows how to do this. So you have to have a lot of detail. You have to describe collaborations. You have to include the appropriate statistical expertise that's always looked at. So even if you describe the statistics that are going to be used, you have that insert, the reviewers are likely to look at whether anybody on the team actually has the expertise to oversee that piece. And of course, you have to do a power calculation. You have to have very carefully thought out inclusion and exclusion criteria. In a grant that we just submitted, we had a carefully considered exclusion criteria, but the reviewers didn't agree that we should exclude on that basis. And so now we're taking in a much broader, if we're refunded in our resubmission, we now have eliminated that exclusion. So it can go either way. And you have to discuss your proposal in the context of previous studies. It's very important, and in current clinical practice. So it's very important that you know the field. You can't just come in and think your idea is so original, but you don't really know what others in the field think about that. And write to your likely peer review audience in a style that is logical, interesting, and readable. So how do you find out who your likely peer review audience is? I know Mike's going to talk about this, but we always look at who's on the study section, and then we even go so far as to build a book, a notebook with their publications. And so we look at who's likely to be on the study section and what their research has been. And that helps us to get an idea of how they might be viewing the grant. So you'll know what study section your grant is going to, and the roster is public, so you can always do this. Anyone can do this. And then, of course, just the accuracy and all of that. Revisions, be persistent. Make sure you understand the messages in the summary statement, and you need to talk to the NIH staff. You absolutely need to do that, but you talk to them after you get your pink slips, after you get your reviews. And then you ask, can you address the concerns of the reviewers? Are more data required? Or is the basic approach flawed or uninteresting to the reviewers? This is a very important I think, part of this presentation, because we have found it very important to try to decipher whether or not the reviewers are on board or off board with our studies. So on the one hand, there's the score, but I personally find it more helpful to actually look at what the reviewers say. Are they enthusiastic about the study? Do they think it would have wide impact? And then what are the problems? That's more, first of all, it's highly unlikely that your grant would ever be approved on the first submission. Although I know of cases where that's happened, it's highly unlikely. So probably the first time you're not going to be funded. You may not even be scored. But what's more important is to actually drill down and look at the comments of the reviewers and think, is this fixable? And I think one of the skills that we have really developed is really learning how to be responsive to reviewer concerns. And I can tell you some examples of the ways in which we have dealt with this. For example, one of our grants, the pressure ulcer prevention study, went to the National Institute of Nursing Research. And one of the flaws, one of the things that we were really criticized for, was that we were going to be, one of our main primary outcome was incidence of medically serious pressure ulcers. But we didn't have a nurse on our study team who was going to be measuring these ulcers. Well, the way we fixed it was Barbara Bates-Jensen had been on the faculty here, and she was a friend of mine. It turned out she was the world-renowned pressure ulcer expert in the whole nursing profession who developed the BWAT, the major gold standard measurement system, and Barbara joined our study team. Well, that certainly helped with the re-review. So it's really about being able to be responsive to whatever the reviewer's concerns are. Sometimes they will, they could describe a concern, and it seems like within the budget that you have, it's entirely, you cannot fix this concern given the limitations of the R01 budget. However, you can raise other money and do a partnership, a public-private partnership. And in well elderly, the first well elderly study, in order to have sufficient power, we needed a certain sample size. But if we were going to include that sample size, we would have exceeded our budget that NIH could actually give us. So we had a choice at that point, either downsize the sample, which then we believed we wouldn't have sufficient power, or raise money to do the sample size to be able to include the sample size that we needed. And we raised the money. We raised $100,000 then. And so really it's about looking at what they're criticizing and then trying to be very responsive. The other thing that I'd say that isn't really in this is that it's important to really turn your grant around quickly. And that's because people come on and off study sections, and all things being equal, you really want the same reviewer who criticized your study the first time to review it the second time so that they can see how responsive you were to their concerns. And so there really isn't time to think about when are you going to resubmit. I'd say always, all things being equal, submit in the next cycle. And so this gives you an opportunity to improve your application. And, you know, it actually is a good thing. We just went through this major resubmission, this redoing of the seed grant, the sensory integration grant. And, I mean, it is so much better than the first. It really is. I'm looking at everybody looking at me that was on that team. And it just is something about which we can feel a lot prouder, I think, because we did have an opportunity to really improve it. So build time in your career plans to deal with resubmissions. Expect to have to do them. So it's a good time for new investigators. You probably know this because the R01 success rate for new investigators should be similar to established PIs. They've They've put in incentives, ways in which new investigators get handicaps so that they are more likely to get additional points for being new investigators. And NIH has extended the pay lines for new investigators, so it's a good time to go in as a new investigator. Now, if you don't know about the scoring system, does everybody know the scoring system here? I don't want to bore you if you do. You do? Everyone? No? You don't? They're scored from 1 to 9. There's 9 bins. There's an overall impact score. A reviewer is asked to give an overall impact score, individual criterion scores, and then the criteria have to do with these things: significance, investigators, innovation, approach, environment. And this just shows you where in the application these things are covered. And this is the new page limits. If you don't know them, they're really nice, I think. You have to learn to be concise and incisive. So the introduction is 1 page. Just 1 page. Specific aims is 1 page. And that's single-spaced. For an R03 and R13 and the smaller grants, the whole narrative is 6 pages. So it's not overwhelmingly huge. You just really have to know what you want to do and how to do it and get to the point. There's no room for any kind of fluff in these grants. And then the R01s, the R15s, the R34s, and the 42s, they're 12 pages of narrative. The Career Development Awards are 12 pages, but it's divided between the candidate information and the research strategy. So a K looks very different than an R. I read Ks, and I've seen Rs as well. A K, 50% of it will be about who this investigator is and why NIH should invest in this person and what the mentoring plan is. And in an R, it'll be all a research plan. So I don't want to bore you too much with this. This is the first subcommittee roster, and that's the in-house NCMRR standing committee that I serve on. So I have a 3-year term. It can be renewed. I think Terry Sanger has been on it for 3 years and now is doing another term. So we have 2 USC people on this study section. But if one of your grants came up into our study section, we would have a conflict of interest. We would have to leave the room. But this just shows you there are quite a few PTs on this, physical therapists, and a lot of neurologists and physicians. I'm not going to really go through this. I don't think I need to explain the scoring. The bibliographical sketches are really important because now in the new grants there's no room to say much about the investigators in the 12 or 6 pages. So in the biographical sketches you really want to write a very solid description of why you want to be a part of this study. If you're the PI, why you're the person that should be leading it. And you really want to show why you're the best person to do this. It's got to be very customized to this grant. It can't be a generic thing about you. You've got to really write, for each grant now we have to write a different personal statement tailored to the goals and aims of that application. That's the process for reviewing. I'm not going to say much about that. Eventually the grants go to advisory council review after they're scored. And usually those are pretty much funded in order, but there can be discretionary zones, and some grants are discussed, and sometimes some are put forward out of order. They also discuss appeals at the council. And then the council makes a funding recommendation to the institute, and then the funding should come through. You've got more information in your PowerPoints, but I'm going to let Mike talk to you now a little bit more about the practical experiences that we've had, and then we'll be up for questions, open for questions. You need.
I guess it's my turn now. Okay, and I guess, yeah, Florence, she goes to Washington and meets people. I've never been there. I guess if I was, we'd lose all our grants. They'd be canceled. I kind of work at the ground level back at home. And what I kind of wanted to do was just give maybe some of my ideas and insights I've had over the years on a practical level. And it's tilted towards people who are kind of getting started, the trainees and others of you who are sort of getting started. And the question is, what does it really take to succeed in this endeavor with grants? And it's one thing to talk about it and to get all the information and everything, but really in your own life and in your own academic career, what really needs to be done? One observation is that the bar seems to be very high, and it's getting higher. Money is more and more scarce. The competition is tougher and tougher. The number of hoops that you have to go through is more and more. So it's important to realize that. And a very common mistake, consequently, is to underestimate the amount of time and effort and sophistication that's necessary for grants. And most people who start out on a little grant career, at the beginning, they're not totally successful, or they come in late with their proposals. Or I remember early on, we were not that experienced, and out of the woodworks comes all these different things. You think you finished it because you wrote a good scientific project up, but then there's a human subject section. Then there's the abstract, then there's the bio sketches, and some people don't have it in, and then there's the references, and there's the enrollment table, and all these different things. And there were 3 occasions in my first 5 years in the division where I was up right near the end, not just up all night, but up 2 nights in a row with no sleep. And once I remember I just got up and I walked, just smacked right into the wall. I was so tired, So you'll hit the wall. And you got to plan, don't underestimate this. And experience is really, really important. So just a bunch of talk and theory is one thing. But if you haven't started, one piece of advice is just start and get your feet wet and get some experience and see what it's like. There's no good substitute. Everything okay?
Not really. No, I mean, we need two mics. But that's okay.
Well, we have to. Me and this.
No, you're doing fine. You're doing fine, but if we
Okay.
can't both talk at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
Well, you mean if you talk without it, you can't get on that?
Do you need me to be on it to do? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, what if we just put this thing in the middle?
We'll pass it this way. Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
See if we can do that.
Okay.
We can write grants, but we can't figure it out. Okay, this is great.
So
I
you're
didn't want to say anything. I was just worried because I needed to. Or
Okay.
felt I should. No,
Okay.
you
Okay, so anyway, you need to more or less anticipate that it's a bigger endeavor than it would seem at first blush, and you need to count the cost. You're going to have to sacrifice to do well, especially over the long term in the world of grantsmanship. So the main hurdle also, as implied by Florence, is a scientific review. To get a good score and pass the critical scrutiny of the panel of members, maybe 3 people who are going to be looking at this, sometimes nitpicking and so forth. And so the proposal has to be good. NIH looks at it like, say NIH, okay, they're investing in you. And so they don't want to feel like you're wasting their money. So they want you to be good and succeed because they're basically accountable. They don't want to waste money by throwing it away on projects that turn out to be bum steers. And the proposal kind of gives a hint at the quality of the investigator, the quality of the research, and so forth. So what's needed for success? Some of the things are excellent writing skills. If something's poorly written, it's a big turnoff. And it's right that generally they won't take, the reviewers will not take something seriously if it's not well written. Okay? Excellent writing skills. You need good scientific skills, and you have to have a good conceptualization and be able to explain things clearly. And then it also helps to have a good publication record. I think a lot of times people are looking at that. If you have a lot of publications, they have more confidence in you, which means it's sort of the chicken and the egg dilemma when you're getting started. You don't have a lot of publications maybe because you haven't had funded research, and so they take that into account, of course. But one recommendation is the whole rest of your academic career, even when you're not doing grants, get as many publications as you can, especially on the topic that you are going to be proposing to study with your grant. And then there's a certain amount of social intelligence, and I think this is one of the areas out of many where Florence has really, really shined. And that is, see, getting these grants is sort of like a dance, okay? There's two parties involved. There's you and your team maybe, and then there's the NIH and the reviewers and all of that. You need to know your dance steps, but you also have to appreciate that you're working, you know, kind of with some other party, okay? You can't just be a maverick. Okay, I've kind of looked at the grants that have been funded that we did, and we've had a lot that weren't funded. There's a little graveyard of efforts that were not funded. We put our heart and our soul into those just as much as we did with the funded ones. And you're almost in tears sometimes when you get the summary statement and people don't understand exactly what you had in mind, or you get some unfair criticism. It comes with the territory because the reviewers, they're human too, and they make mistakes. Sometimes you'll have a great project that doesn't get funded, and sometimes they'll overlook problems in other projects. It's sort of like submitting a paper for publication, the same type of thing. But anyway, you need to have a certain awareness of what people are looking for, what would be of interest to the reviewers, and you have to sort of fit in. Okay, so early on, I didn't know, and we didn't know, that they sort of have a disdain for exploratory research. There's sort of a bias in favor of having the model, already knowing what you're going to find before you do the study, which seems a little paradoxical, but they want a model, and we didn't know that. And if you don't have that model, they'll be asking for it, and you'll look like a rube. It'll look like you're just coming out, you know, and not knowing what you're doing. So there's certain things that you have to be aware of. And they also tend not to like exploratory research, where I think exploratory research sometimes is very, very important. And sometimes they didn't want qualitative research. That's changing a bit now. But there's certain biases about methodological strategies and so forth, and you need to be aware of all that. So you kind of have to really fit in. And perhaps the most important thing, did anyone here ever hear the story? It was a short story about Bruce and the spider. There's a king in Scotland, and anyway, he had been routed by the King of England, and he was kind of hiding out, and he had tried 6 times to thwart the King of England, and he lost these battles, and he was kind of hiding out in this little shack, and it was raining, and he saw this little spider, and it was trying to make this web from point A to point B, and he was watching it very intently, and 6 times the spider came and fell down. 6 times. This king named Bruce, 6 times he had tried to stop the British, or the English, and he couldn't do it. And then he was watching that little spider, and the 7th time that thing connected and the spider was successful. And that motivated him to try the 7th time against England. And he did, and he made it. So don't get so discouraged that you give up. It's par for the course to have a few early failures. You can look at a lot of the people who succeeded, like Abraham Lincoln. He lost a bunch of elections at first and so forth. But perseverance is really critical. I would say that's a very important quality. Perseverance in general, with your idea about getting grants, and also perseverance about a specific grant. You know, you have to know, like the gambler said, when to hold them and when to fold them. Sometimes, and we've had this, it's best just to throw the idea out, say it didn't work, and do something new. We had this grant we were doing on lifestyle redesign for overweight and obesity. And we thought we had a very good program. It made sense. It was consistent with what we did in well elderly. But we hit a landmine, and that landmine was that the aficionados on the review panels and so forth, they sort of didn't think that any kind of group program for combating overweight or obesity would produce long-term results. And we argued till we were blue in the face that lifestyle redesign could potentially do this, but they never really bought into it, and it was obvious to us that it would be very difficult to win them over just because of the way that they conceived this type of research. And so because of that, we never really kept pursuing that. But we didn't give up. We did other ideas, you know, and a fairly high percentage will come through. Maybe not more than half, but the idea is to keep getting good stuff out there, and eventually you'll hit the target. But perseverance is really critical. There was another juncture. It was after we were funded for Well Elderly 1 and the funding ran out. And I think we counted, was it 13?
At least.
13 proposals that we submitted that were not funded. We went 0 for 13. But then later, we didn't give up, okay? You know, we kept going, and then we got some big ones. So that's sort of the nature of the beast. You have to anticipate that, and it's not a reflection on you or your ability necessarily. Remember, it's a dance. Sometimes the other person messes up and misses the step and trips up, and you did your part fine, you know. But it's important to believe in what you're doing and to persevere. That cannot be overestimated. So I think, are there any questions or comments as we go along? Okay. If there are, then people should, you know, just raise your hand and we can talk about the issue. Yeah.
Do you think we need dance therapy?
Well, Florence is taking dancing lessons. It's helping her grant success rate.
Maybe I'll write the music for it.
Okay.
Yeah, somebody has a question.
Oh, okay. Question.
I think y'all made some really good
You have to
points
repeat
here
the
about
question.
grant writing and how to kind of dance through the NIH. I think one of the things that's also very important is, and you alluded to this, so I'm kind of just supporting a point that you made about you have to make it interesting to that study section. Catch their interest in the first paragraph on your specific aims. And if you don't get their interest, their interest in reading the rest of that proposal, it will be tempered a bit. It may go away, and you really have some interesting points, and they're buried on, depending on the page limit, they're buried on page 6 or page 12. So I think it's really critical. We talk about this all the time at these workshops, and we emphasize the fact that you really have to get their interest immediately. You have to get that hook in the mouth. Then you tell your story, but you have to give them impact and significance right up in the front of that page. Not even at the bottom of that page, in the front of that page, not on top of that page. But it just supports, I think, several things.
Yeah, I want to say that that's why it's also good to know who the reviewers are going to be and what they've written about, because that gives you a clue about what matters to them. And it's especially in a field like occupational therapy, you can think you're writing for the community of occupational therapists who have a certain perspective on something, but really you're getting a group is reading this who do not speak your language, and that language will just put off the reviewers right at the beginning. So, for example, in our aging grants, we use activity, the words from gerontology like social, and religious, and productive activity. We don't use really the occupation word because the reviewers don't use that word. So it's very important to just really get a feeling for the style in which the reviewers write. We have somebody on our team now, on the Well Elderly team, who's trying to get an RO3, and he's a very distinguished biostatistician, but he's used to writing for biostatistical mathematical audiences in those kind of journals. And the reviewers won't necessarily have a perspective, the background to really, there's a lot of missing material that he needs to provide for this kind of review group. So it's really important to tailor it. I agree.
Okay, yeah, and to put something right up front, there's sort of like a primacy effect. The reviewers don't have that much time. They don't sit and obsess over a semicolon on page, 7, unless it's something that goes against their theory and they're obsessed with shooting you down. But no, they will not have all the time in the world usually. And so if you put something up front, put it in italics, make it bold to connect with them right away, that's really a good idea, and that's an important strategy.
Another good point that Florence made was trying to get the resubmission into the next cycle to maintain kind of hopefully whatever momentum you generated in your first one. But all the time tell people now to spend a lot of time on that first shot and not do it in a week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, because you've only got 2 shots. And if you only have 2 shots, the first shot doesn't look too good, it's going to influence the second shot. If you get the same people or go to the same study section and get most of the same people, you hope you do, they're going to be looking for very specific things that you should have done. If that gets to be overwhelming because you didn't take the time in the first place, then you got to back out and say, okay, I need another strategy here. I need to look at this in another way, and I need to approach it from a different direction.
Yeah.
I always try to counsel people to write their first grant like they're going to get it.
Yeah,
But you got to look at it.
we agree with that philosophy, and also I think that the review will be more to the point. If they really like it, the first time, the comments will be stuff that they are more serious, and you'll have a higher score going in, and you just have a much better chance. Yeah.
I also think it's important for new scientists to work alongside people that are developing grants through the whole process to submission so that they can see how much is involved. I've had experiences where people join our teams and they leave 3/4 of the way. They have to go somewhere or whatever, and they don't actually see the thing to completion, so they don't see how much work really goes into it. And we iterate millions of times. I mean, the people that have worked with us on SEED, you know how many times we iterated every piece of it, meaning constantly, because you keep going deeper and deeper to get more and more precise. I think people do underestimate how much work has to go into it to make it precise.
Right. I would estimate that when I'm working on a grant, we probably have a serious draft of the main proposal narrative at least the square root of 900 times. I'm saying at least 30 times there's a serious effort to produce a better draft, the way that we've worked. I just hate to say what it's the cubed root of, but it's the square root of 900 times. It means, and that's serious, going through it with a fine-tooth comb, obsessing over different possibilities. You can read it for grammar and punctuation, then you can read it from a broad bird's-eye perspective as far as the ideas. You can read it for the scientific aspects and so forth. And you read it from the eyes of the reviewer. You read it from the eyes of yourself. You really take this seriously, because if you don't, it'll show and you probably won't be funded. Okay, so a few other points here. One is a lot of what we've talked about pertains to a specific grant, but there's also a grant career sense, okay? And becoming a successful grantsman or woman career-wise is sort of like breaking into Hollywood. Once you get name recognition, a lot of publications, some good funding under your belt, and so forth, it all becomes easier. It's like an avalanche or a snowball effect. At first, it's really, really hard, but then if you keep up with it and you're successful, it gets easier and easier, and then you can get in the zone after a while, and which is it makes it a lot easier. People know who you are, they trust you, and then when they read your application, you'll have a better chance. That's my opinion. Is that?
It depends the size of the grant too. I mean, I think that that's true for like an R01, but I think if you go for what makes sense given where you are in your career, that increases your chances. So, building that reputation. If I went in now for an R03, I think they would be surprised. Why is she going? It wouldn't really make sense. They wouldn't really get it. Unless I would make it so they would get it. So it would be something so innovative. It would have to be something so innovative. And I would have to frame it that this is so innovative that I want to pilot test this and make a very strong case, because the first thing they're going to ask is, why is she going for an R03 when she's had 3 R01s? So, with everything, I think it really helps, though, if you've had the mentoring. In other words, what Mike said is true. All things being equal, people that have very solid reputations, have a great chance of being refunded because they've already proven. I've even heard it said that you're not funded on what you will do, but on what you have done. You're funded on what you have done rather than on what you will do. That people really look a lot at track record. So that's an advantage. But on the other hand, I think if you've had the right mentors around you and you've done the Ks, and that really also can increase the probability of you getting what you're going to go after. So knowing the mechanisms is important. And by the way, that's a lesson I didn't always. I ignored the mechanisms for years. To be honest, when I first got well elderly, I met with Robin Barr, who's now very high in NIA. And he was up with the first project officer. And I remember Jeannie Jackson and I 20 years ago sitting with him and asking him about what's next. And he said, learn the mechanisms. And I thought, I don't want to learn those Ks. I'll just keep going for R01. It just all seems so confusing, the mechanisms. But now that I've had much more experience, those mechanisms are real, and they really do function the way they're supposed to.
Okay, question, comment? Okay, I'll let Florence take that one. You have an opinion.
Well, I think that's why the mechanisms are in place, so that you can come in at a level where you're likely to get funded as PI. So the R03, but starting with the Ks. The Ks are a great way. Once you've got a K under your belt and you've been successful, you've got 10 publications off the K with you first author on at least some of them, enough of them. People really do look in, when they're doing the review, they really look at the publication record and they try to make sense of it. They try to make a narrative out of it. So, they'll see, well, there are 14 publications here and she's first author on 3, but these are the most recent ones. It looks like she's now really, and they're this far spaced apart. And I heard, I was meeting with a mentee of a colleague the other day, or about 2 weeks ago, and she said that her mentor taught her that she should be working on a publication a week. So I think some of it is also thinking about how much time you're actually dedicating to writing and what you think is the reasonable length of time to produce a publication.
Right. In general, I would say that every step you take should be calculated. You don't want to just jump in with a major R01 for your first award or something like that. You want to go through the system and all of that. And you want to get as much experience as you can, but it should be in the right way. So that's like this career trajectory thing. The avalanche has to start with some little pebbles and then larger size rocks before the whole thing comes down, you know. So, yeah, and do indeed work with the system. That's an important part. That's part of the dance. Okay, working within the system, it means that you do the stepping stone grants as appropriate. Okay, and then working with the project officer. That's another part of it. And then also knowing what's being funded and fitting in with that. You kind of work within the system. If you just come out as a total shock and bolt from the blue, they'll think you're from outer space, and they'll have a little chuckle and triage you. That's what'll happen.
So, you know, we have this T32, and that was a this T32 training center. And that was a tough sell because we were being very innovative in establishing a T32 training center to prepare people in randomized community-based rehabilitation trials of complex interventions. I mean, nobody had done anything like that. All the other T32 training centers were really very much diagnostically on muscle or on, you know, a particular condition, diagnostic condition. So we're coming in a very, very innovative way. And the first time we submitted, I'm not sure it looked like this would be funded, really. I mean, there were they gave us a lot of criticisms. And we were able, though, to pare it down and do what they asked for. I think we had something like 26 things that we changed in it. And I think this one had about 26 things, you know, including how many of these seminars we have and what courses we're making our T32 doctoral trainees, postdocs do. But in the end, we did get it in a very competitive competition. I didn't think we would, but I'm very glad we did. Because I knew it was really a breakthrough. It was a breakthrough. This was a breakthrough kind of concept. And it's been hard to implement in some ways because it's so easy to just fall back to, well, we'll do what the others, we won't do this, you know, we'll fall back and do what's always been done rather than this innovative thing. And we're really trying to push to keep it on track with the mission of this T32. NCMOR.
Yeah, one of the things you also might mention is the multiple PI mechanism, which is relatively new, and it's not really, it's intended to allow for on a, you know, wouldn't do it on an RO3, but on a larger RO1 to have multiple PIs. So it's intended to allow for people with different areas of expertise to get the PI recognition. But one of the aspects of it that can be useful is that you can have a more senior person as one of the PIs and a more junior person, even a new investigator, as the other PI. And so it can help. A new PI can sometimes piggyback with a more experienced PI, and it's a way sometimes to get, and we've had some success, you know, with that as well. So it's worth keeping that in mind for the right situation.
Yeah, I think that's really good because there's also new things coming up. You don't want to be a dinosaur. It's good to know what's going on in NIH, et cetera, you know, every year, and because new opportunities surface, and there's different trends and norms and fads, and part of the social intelligence regarding NIH, et cetera, you need to develop is being aware of that and knowing how to use that to your benefit. So, okay, the next thing that I would bring up is understanding of the so-called dependent variables of grantsmanship. There's some fake dependent variables, and by dependent variable, I mean basically an outcome of your effort. The independent variable is sort of like you, and then the outcome is sort of like the dependent variable. Okay, dependent variable number 1, and this is something that's necessary but not sufficient. That's the proper effort. Okay, that you want to put forth good effort, at the end of the day, you don't want to say, I was half-hearted, you know, and kind of my failure was due to that. You put forth a good effort, and that's necessary. Number 2 is a great proposal. You could put forth a great effort, but somehow not have a good proposal. That's also necessary to have a really good proposal, but it's not sufficient for funding. Okay. Number 3 is getting a great score. Okay. Now we're getting a lot closer, but you can get a really good score, and it might be like you're better than 75% of the applications, but the cutoff line might be at 15%. Unless you get over that generally speaking, that 15%, you're not going to get funded. So even getting a great score, I mean, that's consolation, you know. I guess there's a sense in which that's sort of for losers or something. You really want to get funded. Okay, but suppose you get funded. Now here's dependent variable. That's number 4, whether or not you're funded. It's more or less dichotomous, okay? And then if you get funded, that's still not the end of it. There's more dependent variables coming. Okay, one of them is that your project comes out well. You could get funded, but if for some reason you had some problem, you might get results that are very murky. Or you could get funded, but maybe you can't recruit everyone, and then eventually your funding will be withdrawn, or you have insufficient power, and whatever it is you wanted to show, say you have some intervention that's really a good intervention, and you get funded, but because of your study and the way that you pursued it, maybe the intervention won't shine like it should, and it could kill the intervention. And the worst thing in the world in retrospect was you getting funded. So you want to make sure that, when you get funded, the study really is good, and that's even more important than whether or not you get funded. Although whether or not you get funded could lead to that, still you want positive results, you want to benefit society, you also want to get publications after you're funded, which will help the avalanche along the way. It'll be pretty far by that point. Yeah. Well, I think there's an example in one of our studies. Like Florence was saying, nowadays the bar has gotten so high. We have a grant proposal for autism, and it's an intervention, based on sensory-based therapy. And okay, originally we had our intervention condition, and then we had a standard care control condition. And that comparison, I think, would be really appropriate and fair. There's a certain practical sense in which that's an important question. If you add this intervention to what kids are already getting, does it make a difference? But the norm is that you want comparative effectiveness. It's not good enough just to have some sort of do-nothing control versus your intervention. They want another bona fide intervention, so you're testing between two interventions. Now, if you think about it, there's a need for both. Usually there should be a need for both of those types of control groups. If you just have two intervention groups, if your intervention besides the one that you're really interested in, that is your so-called control intervention, is a super duper intervention, and those kids do super great, your intervention could still be very effective but do worse than that other intervention. And what would be happening would be you'd be killing your intervention by means of comparing it with something that's so far off the chart and so great. So, right. But if you have the standard care control, you still can show that your intervention made a positive difference, relative to standard care. And if the dependent variables are a little different, you can still argue for your intervention. So you want to set it up so you're not set up for failure. The more classic example would be if somehow you could justify your sample size and smuggle your study in, whereas you knew that you might not have sufficient power. So you get funded, your name's in the lights, you're the big cheese and all that, but you're killing your intervention because you really didn't have the power. So make sure that you have a good test of what you're doing, or else the whole thing could blow up in your face and backfire.
Yeah, this is a really important point. And that is, putting the good of society ahead of your ambition to get tenure or anything else. So, people out of desperation might do anything, but of course, in the big picture, what we really care about is trying to get at the truth, not that it's always approximated, but we're always trying to find out, what can we say about the effectiveness? And when we first started in our intervention research, we were terrified. When we got our first RH1, we were so terrified. Stan was, part of it, that the team said, well, maybe we shouldn't take it, because we were terrified. This was the first well elderly study, because we were afraid that what if we didn't show the effectiveness of occupational therapy, that intervention? Would we be bringing down, the whole profession? I mean, we really were terrified. And I said, well, if we don't really believe this intervention works, why are we training students in this profession? So the only thing that gave us the courage, really, to move forward with that study, and this was very early on, before people were doing these kinds of studies, was that we knew that we had a very sound design, and we were going to trust the science. And the other thing about doing intervention studies is that you've got to wait in suspense for years. Like right now with our pressure ulcer prevention study, we're in our 4th year and we don't have a clue about whether the intervention is effective. So, you've got to a certain extent, design the science as best as you can, and then say what you're really after is the truth. But you've got to really think through the study. Design.
Right.
You go ahead.
Okay.
We think a lot about this because we're always worried that we've got it.
You need,
design, we're setting ourselves up.
Yeah, you need confidence that your design will really give you essentially the power that you need, because there's a lot of things that could cause a type 2 error of some sort. For example, measures that aren't sensitive to detecting change, or maybe measures that haven't been validated with the ethnic group that you're working with, and so forth. And then your results are basically going to be a commercial, good or bad, for your intervention. So it's important to know your science and have confidence that you're going to get a result that's not misleading. Okay, so another outcome after that that's even more important than just getting funded and having a study that comes out well, what would that be? Well, it would be having a long-standing research program. So if you're very successful, you can have a series of grants, like the Well Elderly series, for example, 2 or 3 large-scale studies, and then the benefits are multiplied. So that's another outcome. And then the very highest outcome after that, I bet no one can guess what that is. The biggest, most noble aspects of grantsmanship? Of course. No. It's siphoning all the grant money into your own personal bank account. And the reason I say that, it's my way of saying you need to be very ethical in research. And you need to take great care. You have a responsibility when you do get a grant to be fair, honest, and give society the proceeds back. So just by way of antonym, that's my way of saying that you want to have a lot of integrity with what you do in the research process.
Okay. I think that one thing that we've learned is that in every study you learn more about how to be better at such studies. So one of the real shockers for us was in Well Elderly 2, the protocol said that there were going to be 6 months of group intervention and up to 10 individualized sessions in the lifestyle redesign intervention. And on average, well, I won't do the punchline yet. So we found out that the therapeutic effect for most of the outcome measures kicked in the most robustly. A strong predictor of a very good outcome was if there had been at least 5 individualized sessions. And in graph after graph after graph, Rand Wilcox's different procedures showed this burst after 5 individualized sessions. Well, it was that therapist's judgment about how many of those individualized sessions would actually be implemented for each person. And it turned out that on average, the therapist provided 2.2 individualized sessions. And they could have gone up to 10. So And so why did that happen? Well, there are a lot of hypotheses, but one hypothesis is that based on Well Elderly 1, the group format of the intervention was so hyped. The therapists themselves were very hyped about the group format. And there was an individualized component in that intervention as well, but the therapists liked the group parts. And so did the clients. They seemed to like it. And so for some reason, in the culture of our department, there was kind of, I think, a bias that the most important component was the group work. And actually now we think the individualized component is really critical. And today I'm so happy because these studies are finally getting some national traction. So today I was interviewed by AARP's Research Foundation, all about these studies and how this could be used and disseminated and all of that. And I emphasized a lot about the individualized sessions. So the science, I would have provided more oversight regarding therapists' judgments about whether or not to have those individualized sessions if I had known this. So now in Well Elderly 3, which will be developing a grant for an implementation study in LA with the Department of Public Health here, in Well Elderly 3, we will provide a lot of oversight, and we will probably insist on no less than 5 individualized. So each, you learn about dose, you learn about all these things. It's very fascinating.
Okay, I think we're nearly out of time. I had a list of specific pointers to share, but maybe I could just very quickly just go through them in the 2 or 3 minutes we have left. Okay, and these are things, a lot of the things on my list we've already talked about. Okay, but one of them is it's good to have a site that will fill the bill. Okay, you need to get enough subjects. So if you can work with a well-known site, we've had Angeles Plaza Rancho and Los Angeles Unified School District, LA County Department of Public Health. These kind of sites where there's a lot of participants prospectively are very good. You might have a couple small sites, but if you need 100 subjects and there's maybe 110 who go to these sites, your recruitment rate has to be so phenomenal. So a few small sites, that won't feed the bulldog. It's important to have good sites because recruitment is a big issue that people look at. A lot of the studies fail because they go out and try to get the subjects and it's harder than they think and they don't get enough subjects and then NIH pulls the plug on a study. That's happened before. So recruitment's a big issue that reviewers look at, and if you get a good site and they're going to co-participate with you, that's a big plus. Another thing is it's good to have someone who's experienced and funded in the same area review your proposal. It's not against the rules to either hire a consultant or have someone look at the proposal and give you feedback, because it's such a complex undertaking that any single individual is likely to miss some important things that should be in there or shouldn't be in there and so forth. Okay, another thing is anticipating reviewer concerns. It's almost like a little chess game, and you have to obsess about potential problems in your research design, because we tend to have blind spots, and we have our little schema, our cognitive schema and way that we think about things, but sometimes there's little holes that we don't know about. Like Bobby Fischer was considered one of the greatest chess players ever, and in analyzing his games, it's been said that when he did lose, it was because he typically went on with his own plan and was thinking about that and didn't foresee the opportunities that the opponent had, for counterplay and so forth. Okay, so, but there's a bit of that chess in grantsmanship. You have to anticipate the moves of the reviewers and how think of all logical possibilities. Where could they go to criticize this or that? So that's another thing. And then be sure to justify all your research design decisions. Why do you have the specified number of subjects? The power analysis needs to be there. The instruments. Why these instruments? And then why not the alternatives? That's very important, justifying what you're doing. You can't just say, I'm going to do this and not give a reason. Okay, that'll get you into hot water. And then usually when you get a grant, it's going to be like Florence said on the second submission. The bar keeps getting higher. Originally, there was no limit on the number of submissions. Okay?
But there's 3.
Not when I started. There was no limit. No limit. Then it was 3, and now it's 2. Okay. Pretty soon, the pages started out at 25. Okay. Now it's 12. And I predict that within a few years it'll be 1 character. That's your whole grant. You know, the bar keeps getting higher. If it's limbo, the bar gets lower. Whatever. It's getting harder and harder. So when you're revising in your second submission, there's a principle that we used and talked about a lot. Do not rock the boat. Areas that were not criticized, okay, unless there's really some important reason or you had some flash of brilliance that you didn't have before, it's better to leave it alone. Why give them something to chew on if they're teething with their neurosis, in other words? Okay. So it's better, you know, other things being equal, you don't want to make a bunch of changes that'll give the reviewers problems, you know, and new things to find, new faults, you know, and problems. And it's better if they liked something, to other things being equal, just keep it the same. Make the review process simple. Okay, so I think that's just about all I have to say.
I think it's helpful to be OCD, obsessive. It works in this context. But really, I think a lot of the things that Mike has just said, I think those that worked on us recently on the seed, we went through this. I mean, I don't know how many meetings we had to have on just what measures, nailing down the measures. And then the other thing that Mike didn't mention is this whole idea of working with teams. And, how do you get everybody to agree and come together? But I think the main takeaway is that, oh, go ahead. Do you want to? Well, we can give you this whole thing. This is, Danny, you can send this, right?
It's also it's being videotaped, and so that will be posted on the TREET website as well.
Yeah, but I think you should give we'll send these out, and there is more to it, a lot more about the scoring, and the details on.
I'm interested in that, but equally interested in the second part of this discussion.
Oh, this discussion's on, yeah. Yeah, this could go on a lot longer, this discussion. I wish we had more time. But I do think that this is a process that if you are doing a grant, if you're planning to do a grant, find a team to help you that's experienced. Because they can really ask the right questions and challenge you to stretch to get the detail that you need. You need a lot of detail. And the other thing is plan that you're going to have to put lots of time in. People are really shocked. I know with me, people are shocked that come in and, they see me as the dean and traveling and all that. But the people that actually see me working on grants, they know the hours I put in. It's when you wouldn't see me, it's 5 in the morning. It's 9 and 10 at night. It's on the weekends. I'm making up with the other things I do. I'm having to make up the time on times when I might. There's nothing. You've got to put the time in. That's the thing. And practice.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's great. It's a lot of fun. I mean, yeah. Let me say the final. I mean, I think it's a ball, really. I mean, I'm so proud when we get one in. It feels like such a victory after working hard, and now we're in suspense and waiting. But you win. It's more like an athletic. It's almost like an athletic competition where you win some, you lose some, but you feel so good when you've got something good.
Yeah, it's sort of like darts. You just have to keep throwing them. Even though you're blindfolded, eventually you'll hit the bullseye. So it's sort of like that. But remember, perseverance, and the main thing for the neophytes, people getting started, is do something. Okay, in other words, Don't just kind of let it slide and be indecisive, but get some experience, go out and really try and get started. And that's sometimes the hardest part, but it can be the most important.